Are you responsible for complex projects that have instructions or documentation associated with either compliance or instruction or simply selling of that product? Hey, I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations, and we talk about the value of clear communications in conveying ideas and influencing outcomes. And what I find very often in a records management environment is is their focus is on managing the records, like being a librarian, rather than having quality artifacts necessary to handle control validations, to give proper and clear instructions, to evidence work or quality of work. And I see this completely done the wrong way. So let me give you a little background about myself. So first off, I do operational risk management. I write controls, optimize processes. I do control validation. I work in the technical writing side of communicating complex issues. What I often see is that when we're building materials for evidence, for instruction, for white papers, for marketing, for example, it is often done from the perspective of the tools rather than the desired outcome. So people will come in and say, okay, well, we're going to write it in Word, and we're going to do the reports in Tableau, and we're going to store everything on SharePoint. There's a concept that you could just slap together a document in Word and pass it around, and the committee will give you feedback, and ultimately you will have a finished product. Now, within those platforms or even more advanced documentation platforms, FrameMaker, there's some Adobe suites. There's just a god awful number of ways to write a document. The writing of the document is not as important as why we're writing the document, who's the audience of the document, what might this document be used for in the future, how is this document categorized or coded within our compliance environment, uh, where where will the document be live, how will the document be used. I could go on for a day and a half about things that are more important when creating a document than the software we use. Now, I've seen people create documents in text and then extract it out into, maybe they're using Markdown, then they extract it out into Word, and then they edit it. And that none of that matters. None of that matters. Again, you can end up with a document that has no meaning. It has no context. It has no results. So what do we do? What do we do so that we can create materials that communicate clearly and accurately for their intended purpose? Well, let's start first with what's the purpose of the document. Are we writing a document to satisfy some compliance requirement and the document's going to go sit in a library somewhere and we're only going to look at it again next year when we go back through maybe a control stratification or an issue that comes up? That's important to know. Or is this a document that end users will use every day that teaches them how to execute the process and delivers to them the steps necessary to reduce risk? Those are two different documents. Now, they might contain the same information, but they're literally two different documents. In the case of a document that's going to provide instruction, it needs to not only provide instruction, it also needs to give the user a understanding of the reason why they take certain steps. The human behavioral response of opening a document with 47 different steps is how many of these steps can I skip? Now, you might be thinking, well, they're going to go through every step because we're testing them and measuring on that. Well, are you really testing out 43 steps? And is it profitable to test the steps rather than maybe test the desired outcome? And if you're going to measure people on the desired outcome, then open your document with the outcome expected. See, this is how we develop documents that work hard and last for a long time in an organization. But let's say you have the perfect document. There isn't a single document in any large Fortune 100 corporation today that is going to live as it was written forever. So let's say, for example, we develop a policy. We write the policy using policy-based language. It's easy to follow and understand, but then the laws change that influence policy. And so 6 months later, we've got to change the policy, or at least we're going to review the policy for feedback. Two things happen when you send a document around for review. First off, depending on the length of the list of people that receive that document, you will get a wide variety of responses. Number one, in a corporate environment, people want to feel like they're involved, so they're always going to provide some kind of input. And so you're likely to get an exponential number of feedback items if you have a longer list of people. So we have to decide first who specifically is qualified to give feedback on this document. And that very often means you don't give it to senior leadership, because senior leadership can have an opinion, but they may not have the context necessary to have a valid opinion. So what I'm describing here is called change management. We write a document, it's codified, it's accepted, it's approved, it's put in as the policy. Now some underlying factor changes. We have to continue to follow the existing policy while we're drafting either an adapted or new policy. The adapting and the changing of the policy has the review cycles, it has the inputs, it has maybe legal review, it has different types of editors working on the document. You could have subject matter experts, you could have people who just simply look at taxonomy. So now when we're modifying documents, we are modifying them within some kind of change management system or some kind of methodology because of all these changes that are going around. So I mentioned feedback. You're going to get hundreds of pieces of feedback. You can simply list them out, but you won't be able to implement it all. So listing it out is a defect. It's deficient. You have to come back and prioritize changes, validate feedback to make sure it still stays within the appropriateness of the document. Make sure that we're not creeping out the requirements of the document, meaning the more feedback you get, the more suggestions you get, some of which are arbitrary because people want to show that they're involved in the process. You have to know the difference. You have to weed that out. So change management helps with this, both on the organization of the feedback so that it can be applied, but also the checking of the box to make sure that we're still matching the original document's purpose. So we state in the document what the purpose of the document is so that our reviewer or editor kind of has some context to work forward. We also want to make sure that document is saved in such a way that we know what version we're working on, so everybody's looking at the same page. We also want to make sure that these documents are saved in a way that we can evidence the thinking process behind it. So if we're going to write a policy that's going to impact an enterprise, we do want to have someplace the notes, the footnotes that go into why a certain approach is being requested and why a certain element didn't go into a lot of detail, because maybe you want the business to apply the policy according to their needs. You also have to outline any compliance elements. So these things would go into the document. Now, some of the common problems I see is that the document is going through all these processes and it's growing exponentially, and it has a lot of information that doesn't need to be there. One way to address that is again going back and reviewing the document, making sure the document is still on track for the purpose intended. Another mistake I see is where you have all this feedback, great feedback. People have taken the review of the document seriously. They've provided their feedback. They've provided cases and challenges. And now it goes back into the document, but there's too many editors. So somebody puts something in, somebody takes it out. One of the ways to solve that is you have a central person managing the document, usually a technical writer, who's going to compile the materials provided and then provide a conflict list. So if one person says, I want to put this in the document, and the other person says, I want to take that out of the document, now that's a conflict. You have two people work that out, and then they come to an agreement of what should be or should not be there. You want to make sure the document works down a certain timeline, because the longer the document takes, the more likely people are simply going to approve it because they're tired of looking at it. Now, again, I approach this uniquely. I see both the human element and the psychological influences or impact that you have when you're working with a small group. So there's a little bit of organizational psychology here. I'm also looking at the change management elements to make sure that the end result document best reflects the agreements of all the individuals in the chain of editing, so that you aren't constantly working this document over. A lot of times we'll have organizations that will have what's called a living document, where they're constantly editing a document. Well, in the case of a policy or a procedural, you need to be executing that thing, and you might even be measured on the execution of that document. So if you're constantly changing it, it's hard to maintain consistency in application. what happens here is you start getting into versioning and almost a software development approach to creating a document, because a document is code, especially if it's like a policy document or some kind of compliance document. Maybe it's a control. That's actually part of the source code of your business, is the controls that reduce risk. What we end up here is that after a certain version, we now have a package of artifacts that support why that version exists and the rationale of that version, but it's capped off with a finished document. Any modifications and changing to that document are now become a branch. So the document is implemented and consistently used, but anything that's feedback from the application of the document becomes requirements for the next version. If a law, rule, or regulation changes and it's going to influence the document and we start another review cycle and another editing cycle, that is done on the branch, not the main document. Now, what this allows us to do is that after a version is complete and it's incapped with a finalized and approved document, is that previous versions can be purged. So this is where record management comes in. At the end of that work, it gets archived as a project, passed over to records management, and gets stored for the eventual recovery. Maybe it's going to be used as reference. Maybe somebody remembers something that worked well in an old document that has to be recovered because the law reverted. Do you see what we're talking about here? Again, it's a complex effort, and very often you need someone to manage this effort that understands the abstraction and the influence of what makes it possible to deliver that document. Unfortunately, a lot of times we put an administrative person on it. We end up passing around documents on a reading list. So the subject matter experts are all going to get the email at the same time, and they're all working on their own individual copies. And we add all this administrative overhead by compiling and merging that information together. Now, sometimes people do that because they want the individual peer feedback that's not influenced by social group dynamics. So the example there is when you get a group of people together, like a focus group, and you get feedback in a room, every person who responds is influenced by what other people say. So if you talk to the people individually, they might have a better understanding that they can speak confidentially. So there are times where you do want to send the document out and get individual written feedback, which is then compiled into the updates for the document itself. Another way you might want to do it is bring everybody in the room, but you've got to know the difference. So you need somebody who knows the difference depending on the severity of the document. And what I described is actually a pretty complex collaborative editing cycle. And you may not need that for some documents. You may be able to give it to one subject matter expert and one reviewer and be done. So I know I've covered a lot here on the importance of having a change management approach to modifying regulatory documents, modifying controls, modifying the artifacts in the company that have very legitimate dangers of if they're wrong. If an auditor comes in and says, show me the process you use for this, and you give them gobbledygook process documentation that's not the official version, but focuses on the future state, you're going to get an audit issue. That's just how it happens. But if you're able to go to your change management system and see which document is the official version, and then pull that official version out of a library somewhere and hand it over to somebody, and they ask questions, and you go back to the archival materials that support why certain things are in that document, you can handle the audit introduction with fewer people. You can have a better understanding of what the document is. You can modify the document and not have that creep where the document changes over time and eventually has nothing to do with the original reason. And then you also prevent people who claim ownership to a document and they find it part of their job to modify and change these documents. I can't tell you how many times we've rewritten controls in a 3 to 4 year period that were never even used. So there's that element as well. But again, these are complex issues. I want to give you a high-level introduction, and what we've been talking about is the value of a change management approach before you get to records management, before you get to data retention, before you get to other things, so that we can know that we're storing the right document and that it's been properly approved and it is the official version. Actually, Congressional Record does a really good job of this, having their committees and having the notes of each committee. But we don't have the time to discuss all those details. If you have specific questions, I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations, where we discuss how the value of clear communications, how to gain influence and make fewer mistakes when going towards complex solutions. Ask your questions at www.insidestrategicrelations.com. Go to the contact page, simply raise your hand and ask your questions. No question is ignored. In fact, many of the questions are the basis of these podcasts. So, again, when you have important documents, process procedurals, policy, uh, risk acceptance, RCSAs, approach the modification of those documents not according to the tools you have available, but according to some kind of change management philosophy or methodology that is consistent. You're going to get better results, clearer documents, and fewer downstream problems. Again, I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations, and I'll see you in the next episode.